So as much as I'd love to talk about Ole Miss and A&M looking horrible, I think it's time to talk a little bit about this Tennessee-Florida game. Turned out, after they lulled us to sleep for three quarters, to be a pretty epic contest. And surprisingly, I'm going to give Tennessee fans a hard time here because they killed us about the special teams comments in the last video. Their special teams did not show up and maybe cost them the game, but also neither offense in my mind showed up. I know at the end there were a flurry of points. There were a lot of yards. If you look at the stat line at the end of this game, it looks like a pretty clean offensive game on both sides. But I imagine you have some thoughts on why that is sort of a hidden. There's some hidden truth into those numbers. But maybe I'm wrong. So let's take it either side. So either this is a situation where you had two really good defenses battling it out, or you had two pretty poor offenses that just couldn't do anything, or it was something in between. Tell me what you think it was.
Personally, I think these were two pretty good offenses that aren't in rhythm or in sync and don't have much pop, I guess, at the quarterback position. Dormady, I think, we said in the preseason we thought he was probably solid. I think he's underperformed a little bit, but not really relative to what we expected. Dormady isn't good enough to win you a ball game, but he is good enough to kind of take the ready play in front of you. The problem was they made him throw 39 freaking passes. All right. John Kelly had 19 carries for 141 yards. That's a 7.4 yard per carry average. And Dormady threw 39 passes. It kind of boggles the mind, frankly, why they threw the ball as much as they did in this game, only scoring 20 points when they probably could have leaned on the run for the majority of the game and worn Florida down. On the other side of the ball, we came out of the Michigan game, both of us feeling like Feliepe Franks had to be the guy, that they really had to make him the starter and let him sort of take over the offense. He did some things wrong, certainly. He doesn't make very good reads yet. He looks like a freshman on the field, but he also has moments where you can see that he's a pretty good quarterback or can be a pretty good quarterback. I think a big problem really right now for Florida too is I don't know that they have a really good running back. Now Michael Pirine is a strong, sort of solid guy, but he's not overly quick. I don't think he hits the hole that great, and he isn't very explosive. I find it interesting that Malik Davis only got 4 carries, but had 94 yards. He had a 23.5 yard per carry average. And it's easy to say, oh, yeah, but there's a 74 yarder in there because there was. But if you take the 74 yarder out, then the other 3 carries went for 20 yards, which was over 6 yards a carry, which was still the best per carry average for Florida. So I think that's kind of both of it. I don't think Tennessee's defense is necessarily that great. Florida's rushing attack was a lot more successful in this game than they had been in weeks prior. Likewise, I don't know that Florida's rush defense is that great. In fact, to me, the biggest surprise in the game was actually Florida's linebacking play. I was between the linebackers and the safeties kind of appalled for a Florida defense to see what they were able to generate and sort of where they were at because I with that defense I have a pretty high standard, right? I mean, you expect linebackers to be able to fill the hole, you expect the Anzalone guys and Davis, whatever. You expect guys that will be able to fill a hole, pop somebody in the backfield, make a tackle. And we didn't see that. I mean, we just didn't. They 11 and 33 for Florida. I felt like I was calling those numbers out the entire game because they couldn't do their job. I mean, they struggled. David Reese was not a very good guy at filling his gaps. He wasn't a very good guy at moving laterally in the line of scrimmage and attacking the perimeter. He failed to set the edge repeatedly, and the D line made a lot of good plays. But oh my gosh, I mean, it's sort of it's sort of baffling, and I think you can sort of see it in their season long statistics. David Reese, as much as I'm ragging him, is the leading tackler on the team. I think in large part because he's the linebacker with the most responsibility. But if you want to look for the next linebacker on Florida's football team in tackles, it's Vashawn Joseph. He's 11th on the team in tackles as a linebacker. There are, let me count them up here, one, two, three, four linemen ahead of him in tackles, and one, two, three, four, five defensive backs ahead of him in tackles. That should not happen. And it's because of that I felt like Kelly was so successful in this game. I felt like Tennessee, as much as I don't think they're a great defense athletically, I think they're solid and they kind of do what they do and they do it at a good enough level. Um, you know, I think they're missing Kirkland pretty bad, honestly. But yeah, they're good enough. You know, Colton Jumper is a serviceable linebacker. McDowell's a serviceable linebacker. Batuli is serviceable. I say this by SEC standards, which means you're pretty darn good. But you know, Florida, frankly, just looks deficient, and they made John Kelly look like a god. Not to say that he's a bad running back because he's a pretty good one, but I came away from this game honestly less concerned about the offensive performances by both teams as much as I was concerned about the defensive performances. Both one, the general lack of athleticism by Tennessee, which came to bite them in the Hail Mary play, and the just really shoddy tackling and gap assignment play by the center of the Florida defense.
And this is really kind of what you've sort of touched on already. This is not what we expect from a Florida defense. Honestly, I I expect more. Like last year, Tennessee did it late over the top, and that's a little more excusable than just getting pounded on by not a huge running back. We're not talking about Derrick Henry or some massive running back. We're talking about more of a speed guy with Kelly. And you know, I know SEC running backs in general aren't small, but this guy beat on them like he was just pounding them into the dirt. And I could not, for the life of me, I just kept expecting Florida to start making tackles and that Florida defense that we were used to sort of step up. So the question we have is, okay, we've seen Florida defense for a few years be great. And then we saw them really step up against Michigan, but now we're seeing that Michigan might be just a dumpster fire on offense. So, like you said, you're worried about Florida defense. How worried are you about Florida defense long term this season in light of the fact that their offense may not be able to get it done?
I mean, I'm genuinely really concerned. Meaning, you know, I'm not sure that these guys are ever going to necessarily turn into what they need. And I think honestly, what we're seeing right now from Florida is the massive drop off in recruiting from Will Muschamp to McElwain. And why do I say that? Because the two guys I singled out, Vashawn Joseph, David Reese, right? Linebackers, they're both sophomores, okay? They're second year players. Both were McElwain recruits, both were 3-star prospects. David Reese was, I'm looking at 24/7's ranking, 414th nationally. Vashawn Joseph, 651st nationally. Vashawn Joseph was the 42nd player at his position, and he's starting at Florida as an outside linebacker. That's disturbing, okay? And you know, when you have that kind of level of talent or lack thereof, it affects you. And they lost guys that were instant starters, first round, second round sort of draft picks the past few years, and they've replaced them by guys that didn't get recruited by most SEC programs, and the drop off is radical. I don't think they're going to be able to recover from it quickly. I don't know that they're going to be able to recover it from the rest of the year. And you know, we've talked about this a lot on here that people sometimes underestimate how long it takes for stuff to come to effect and how dramatically it can happen. The drop off in talent is finally starting to hit, and the difference between those juniors and above, the CC Jefferson class, Nick Washington, Duke Dawson, those were all Muschamp recruits, and the sophomores and freshmen, meaning Reese, David Reese, Jeremiah Moon, Vashawn Joseph, Chauncey Gardner at safety, is absolutely dramatic. Those guys were. I'm not going to sugarcoat it. Like Chauncey Gardner was a disaster in run support, and he missed. I probably single handedly missed 6 tackles in that ball game, and I don't know. I mean, I have to take a huge step back from everything I thought that Florida was going to be. I can't believe I picked them to win the East in the preseason,
I
and I
didn't.
Yeah, no, you didn't, and I feel like a crazy person. But in my defense, this is we talk about this a lot in the preseason that you haven't seen any of these players play yet, and Florida won this game, sure, but they won it on a big Hail Mary, and I don't know. Right now, I frankly don't see either one of these teams being able to really challenge Georgia in the East.
What's interesting to me about this game, and I know it's tough when you talk about coaches and jobs and losing their jobs. It's a sensitive situation. There's two fan bases here in Tennessee and Florida that are kind of getting tired of their coaches, and I wonder. I think this is kind of an interesting, if not a little dark question. Both fan bases a little upset with their coaches. Both coaches kind of on the hot seat. What is the likelihood of the winning coach in this game losing his job at the end of the year and the losing coach in this game actually keeping it?
Um, I think moderately high. I honestly, coming out of this game, I felt like, as I said earlier, right? If Tennessee ran the ball more, they would have won this game. And Florida was very, very, very lucky to get that Hail Mary to win it late because I don't think they were winning in OT. I think Tennessee is the better team than Florida. I'm not saying they're great, but I think they probably are the better team. I think Florida got exposed in this ball game, and I very easily could see Florida really struggling this season. In fact, I think I'm going to basically call it out now. I think there is a very serious shot that Florida loses to Georgia, loses to LSU, loses to at least one of South Carolina and Kentucky, and struggles with Vandy. In fact, I could see them losing to two of three of Kentucky, South Carolina, and Vanderbilt by the end of the year. I could see them
Yikes.
losing 4 or 5 games in conference play the rest of the year. And I know that sounds crazy, and a lot of Florida fans that I picked you to win last week, may be thinking I'm nuts, but it's the same old, same old. We knew the offense was going to kind of struggle. The defense, I am beside myself concerned with where they're at. We see the same Nussmeier crap that we've always seen. We've been ragging on him for a long time, in years and years in the show. Uh, Nussmeier, when he gets in third and medium, he calls a drag route across the middle of the field. You can see it. It's like clockwork. I think he did it 3 times in a row in that game. If it's anywhere from third and fourth to third and seventh, dating back to his time at Alabama, he is going to take the slot receiver and he's going to run him as a drag and try to get him isolated in a linebacker. At this point, everyone else in the conference knows that Nussmeier does this, so they take it outside the strong safety. And when he crosses the field and the he gets in front of the linebacker, the quarterback delivers the ball, and then the strong safety is waiting about 5 yards ahead, and then basically comes back as a crackback tackle and knocks his head off. So Florida is what it was on offense. Not much has changed there. It's really too late to make a change at the coordinator spot at this point, I think, to save his job, considering that the talent change has already happened. The big concern is, you've already down 2 recruiting classes. We said that effect. You have a third one coming in now. You're not going to be able to keep CC Jefferson for another year. This is going to have really, really long-term implications for Florida, and it's going to take them quite a while to recover from the hole they've dug themselves.
And all of this in light of the fact that they might get that group of 10 players back at some point in the season. You're still this down on them, even when those players come back?
If Scarlett and Callaway comes back, it's going to be a huge infusion. Their biggest problem on offense right now is running back. The offensive line isn't great, but the running backs are not very good. I think they maybe have something in Malik Davis, and they maybe we'll look back at tape and realize that. But P. Ryan is not close to the talent level that Scarlett is. Callaway is easily their best receiver. So if they get those two guys back, they do have some offensive pop. And if they can score some, considering the way the SEC is this year and the fact that most teams are not dominant, they're going to have a much better chance. So I was making sort of this assumption that those guys don't come back because we have no timeline for return. But if they do, then I think they can sort of salvage the season, so to speak. And I
But
say
if they
salvage.
do and they salvage it, is that just kind of kicking the can down the road?
It depends on who they play and when. There's a concept called primacy and recency. The things you do first and the things you do last are what's remembered. And if they end the season on a winning note, they get those guys back, and let's say they beat Florida, they end the year by cleaning up against South Carolina, and they beat Vandy, they hold off against Kentucky, and then they beat Florida State. Nobody's going to pay attention to what happened in the middle, right? And nobody's going to remember what Florida did in the intervening weeks. They're not going to remember that they lost to LSU. They're not going to remember that they, uh, you know, lost to Texas A&M. I said Kentucky and Vandy, but I got that backwards this year. It's actually the end with Missouri and South Carolina. So let's say they lose to Kentucky and they lose to LSU and then they lose to Georgia, but they end on winning Missouri, South Carolina, UAB, Florida State. Well, it's a 4-loss season. They go 8-4. People remember a 4-game win streak at the end of the year, and maybe they forgive it. Honestly, I mean, as much as if they don't fire him after the Georgia game, he maybe gets through unscathed, and he may save his job at the Florida State game.
But
So,
again, I guess my question was more for next year. Like if they do kind of eke out a slightly above mediocre season because they get these players back and get that injection, is that kind of kicking the can down the road because of the issues in recruiting to where we see maybe a situation like we saw at LSU where they really shouldn't have kept Les Miles and then they did and they didn't feel great about it, so they had a hair trigger the next season when the same sort of things materialized.
oh yeah, now that I follow you, yes, I think the reality is looking at the roster and where I see holes, being naming the guys I named, they're all the guys that are returning. The players that made that defense work, really, they're two guys, CC Jefferson and Duke Dawson, and two of the last group really out of Muschamps recruiting classes. They're both going to be gone next year. I don't see any way Jefferson returns. Dawson's a senior. They lose Powell on offense, and none of the offensive guys. They got a lot of guys coming back, but none of them are really, really all that impressive. I think they take a pretty significant step back next year. I don't really see any way Muschamp's going to survive the year next year. I think they're going to be honestly a pretty bad football team. Uh, Maybe it's possible Feliepe Franks turns out to be a really good passer and he could sort of salvage that to some degree, but the defense is going to be considerably worse. So I think it is kicking the can on down the road, and everything they see this year would just come back next year, but come back 10 times worse.
So you played the Grim Reaper this week. We usually trade off. This week it's you. So that's Florida Tennessee. I don't think we're super high on either one of these, but I think of the two, even though Florida won, kind of what you're saying, and I sort of agree, Tennessee has a chance to actually squeeze out a decent season between the two of those teams. So two of the teams that both of these teams will play, Kentucky and South Carolina, played each other last week, and South Carolina coming off a pretty decent looking in terms of optics win over a Missouri team that we thought had a high flying offense, and Kentucky coming off of a game where they struggled against a directional school and eked out a win. And everybody was on the South Carolina bandwagon. I asked you for permission to get on the South Carolina bandwagon. You said don't do it, so I didn't do it. I'm glad I listened, because if I had been on that bandwagon, I would have been really disappointed in myself come this week. So tell us a little bit about what happened in South Carolina and Kentucky, and let's just go with it.
We've talked a lot about how we're both stat nerds, right? And we're 3 weeks in. I think next week, this following week, we're going to have probably enough data to actually do our models, which is really the core of our show that we haven't been able to do, and it kind of sucks, frankly, the first few weeks of the year. But South Carolina statistically has been an anomaly all season. They've been outgained in all their victories. They had 2 wins. The first win against North Carolina State, they get outgained 2-1, and then win kind of at the end in a really close game, basically due to turnovers, due to special team scores, and doing to chunk play scoring when it matters. Last week they had a really dominant win, but they got outgained by 100 yards by Missouri. So, my wife told me I was crazy, by the way, for picking Missouri to beat South Carolina. I did not listen. That was probably me being stupid because I put faith in Missouri. I think it's showing now that Missouri is not just not a great football team or a good football team. We picked them to be a surprise in the East. Missouri is a disaster. And I can't paint that on anything but the coaching staff. And I know that's kind of an aside to this discussion, but it's important to understand that a lot of South Carolina's clout came from the win over North Carolina State that may or may not be a good team. We don't know. It was week 1. and it went over a Missouri team that it turns out, as much as we thought they maybe were shaky after the Missouri State game, Missouri is incredibly bad, and their offense just doesn't function against real defenses. But even still, South Carolina got outgained by Missouri in that win. So the Kentucky game, it was almost the same yardage, 353 yards Kentucky, 358 for South Carolina. South Carolina again got that yardage in a weird fashion. They were only 25% on third down. Kentucky was actually over 50%. They're about 60%. Kentucky was 60% on third down to 25% by South Carolina, and got outgained by South Carolina. So the statistical weirdness continues. A lot of that, in large part, was due to the fact that Kentucky ran the ball a lot. They had 47 rush attempts. South Carolina really didn't try to run it that much. They only had 20. Neither team did it successfully. 3.9 Kentucky, 2.7 for South Carolina. A lot of that was sacks too. South Carolina just threw the ball a lot, 37 attempts. But South Carolina, at the end of the day, just couldn't really sustain drives. They tried to force it a lot through 2 interceptions. Kentucky was the more patient team. When you have Benny Snell is a very good running back. And one of the things that was interesting to me in the Tennessee Florida comments after our preview of that game was people talking about how great Kelly is. I think sometimes people forget how many great running backs are in the SEC. Kelly is a very good running back, deserves the hype after that game. But, Snell is an excellent running back. Ralph Webb at Vanderbilt is an excellent running back. Michelle and Chubb are both phenomenal running backs. Scarlett, when he comes back, is a very good running back. And Dowdle's okay. So most of the SEC East, for all their faults at quarterback, actually have excellent running backs. Most of the SEC East running backs are probably going to play in the pros. So Kentucky sort of rode that bell cow even at a low average and just let Snell keep things going and sort of keep the chains moving enough that they could generate something with a passing game. South Carolina really didn't have that. They were never they weren't really that much less successful than Kentucky, but they didn't try nearly as hard and still weren't as successful. They were leaning on the pass anyway, which meant they were kind of one dimensional. The pass is kind of inherently also sporadic. They had, like we said, Bentley can make any throw, and he looks really good on a highlight reel. The problem is he misses a lot of routine plays. His 8.4 yard per attempt average sort of belies the fact that it came in chunks and he missed the consistent plays. So his QBR, and I think the QBR kind of shows it, right? The QBR being the ESPN rating, which is based off the production made by the quarterback, what he actually adds to the offense. Bentley, 24-36. That's right at 66% passing, 8.4 yard per average, 304 yards passing, 2 touchdowns, 2 interceptions. He only had a QBR of 55.7. Steven Johnson, 16 of 25, no touchdowns, 1 interception, only a 6.8 yard per attempt average, had a significantly higher QBR at 90.6. And it sort of belies the fact that as much as Bentley is doing a lot of stuff right for the offense, he's doing just as much stuff badly. You don't see that in the highlight video, and it's those plays that are currently holding South Carolina back.
And I don't think losing Deebo Samuel for the year is going to help that offensive production at all, which is, I think they were kind of getting in a rhythm, those two. And so when you see a quarterback who's really kind of struggling anyway, having that guy that can kind of make something happen for you not be there, it has the potential to really start to unravel at that point. Okay, so South Carolina, real quick, just to close this game out. South Carolina seems to have done this in the past, even when they were good, when they were 10-11 win good, where they would stub their toe on a Kentucky or a Vanderbilt. Is there any hope for South Carolina to turn this into a nice, clean 9-win type season, seeing what you saw against Kentucky?
I think there's some hope, actually. I think most of the hope comes from the fact that Bentley on any given day can show up and he can make plays that mean you can beat any opponent. I think he could also lose to any opponent, but their schedule helps a lot, right? They get La Tech next week, who's not a great La Tech team. They get Texas A&M and Arkansas that are both reeling. I think it's very, very possible they come out of that 3-0. This is a classic case where I would pick them in each of the three games. That doesn't necessarily mean I think they will win all three put together. There's probably a better chance that they lose one of them, but I think it's about a 50-50 shot that they lose one game. So if they win the next three, they're suddenly now at 5-1, and then you have what is a tough stretch, but not that tough with Tennessee and Vanderbilt. Vanderbilt's going to be a lot more beat up. Tennessee is a beatable football team. Georgia and Florida after that. We've already established the fact that we think Florida could kind of implode and maybe in a bad trend by the end of the season. Then you play Wofford and Clemson. So the real losable games here: Tennessee, Georgia, Florida, Clemson. There's only 4 of them, and you already got one loss. So if you can just win 2 of the 4, if you can beat Florida and you can beat Tennessee, who I don't think Florida, by the way, is going to be ranked at that point. Tennessee probably won't be either. You can lose to the only 2 ranked teams on your schedule, which probably will be Georgia and Clemson, I'm guessing. Beat the unranked teams in your schedule, and well, voila, wave a magic wand, you have a 9-3 season. I will be honest, it won't necessarily mean that they were a great team, but the schedule sets up for them to have a pretty good record at the end of the year, just because they're, they don't play Auburn, they don't play Alabama, they don't play LSU, and when you got that going for you, well, they don't play Mississippi State either, right? The
Right.
A&M Arkansas draw goes a tremendously long way. You want A&M, Arkansas, or Ole Miss out of the West, so that I think really helps them in having a better record.
All right, that's going to wrap it up for our review shows this week. We've got one more week of kind of not so great football, but we do encourage y'all. Thanks for listening to these reviews, because I think we get some of our best commentary observing what happened the week before. I know the previews get a lot of traffic, but the reviews are where the interesting stuff really comes out. So again, thanks everybody for listening and watching these. If you like it, give us a like. If you don't, give us a thumbs down. But either way, we'd love if you subscribe. Thanks so much, y'all. Have a great week. God bless.